Have you ever wondered how a medical device is created? How does an idea eventually make it all the way to market in the medical field? Well, today we are lucky to have with us a medical device inventor responsible for a system now giving thousands of men relief of their prostate symptoms, and how this device came to fruition. You won't want to miss out on this one. So the big question is this: how can men and those who care for them better educate themselves regarding prostate health, the conditions that affect the prostate, and the latest technology in managing these conditions? That is the question, and this podcast will provide the answers. On a weekly basis, we will be chatting with experts, innovators, and leaders in the field of urology, sharing useful information with the general public to improve their lives and increase their overall health. My name is Dr. Garrett Pullman, and welcome to the Prostate Health Podcast. Prostate Health Podcast is for informational purposes only. Nothing in this podcast should be construed as medical advice. By listening to the podcast, no physician-patient relationship has been formed. For more information and counseling, you must contact your personal physician or urologist with questions about your unique situation. I'm very excited to have on the show today medical device inventor Dr. Ted Lamson. Dr. Lamson is co-founder of Neo Tract and a primary inventor of the UroLift System. He served as president and CEO for the first 5 years of the company. He has over 25 years of experience in the medical device industry in the fields of urology, interventional cardiology, ENT, radiology, and cardiothoracic surgery, and holds over 80 patents. Dr. Lamson holds a PhD and Master of Science in Bioengineering from the Pennsylvania State University. Dr. Lamson, you are a true innovator and responsible for a game-changing technology for men with an enlarged prostate. Welcome to the Prostate Health Podcast.
Thanks, Garrett. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank you for providing this podcast service for the urology community. I think the recordings are very interesting.
Well, thanks again. So, Dr. Lamson, now back in 2004, I understand you and Josh Makauer were investigating potential projects in orthopedics, cardiology, and urology. Now, what ultimately sparked your interest in BPH or enlargement of the prostate?
Well, maybe I'll go back and set the setting. Josh and I met back in the early 90s when we were working at Pfizer, back when Pfizer made medical devices way back then. And he left to start an incubator called ExploreMed, and I left shortly after and joined up with him. And we've been working together ever since. Have launched a number of companies around different medical technology ideas. And we'd had some success, and we were embarking on the next round, if you will. And I was running this round, and our typical method is to have 2 or 3 projects that we bring forward, dive deep into, and then usually one of them is a winner and the other 2 go away, and we go from there. So as you said, we were looking at a few different areas of medicine. And during that time, both my dad and my uncle had prostate issues, and that certainly piqued my interest. One, to have that sort of personal connection, and 2, clearly genetically, I was on deck, so to speak. So I started looking into this, and my dad had suffered from post-op retention, and it was then that I realized that he'd had BPH for many years and hadn't been doing anything about it. And the more I dug into this, the more it really seemed like, at least what I called it back then, was an epidemic in undertreatment. And that not being caused by medicine per se, but just by the way patients treated the options. And the options being medications that had some side effects, and then surgery that was pretty threatening to most men, and so not many elected it. And that really got me interested in our general idea is to look at ideas, or if you will, needs in medicine that could really potentially benefit from a shift, a complete change in sort of the care pathway for men in this case to get a better option.
Okay, so now that you had identified that there was clearly a lack of appropriate treatment options available to men at the time, or just men not getting treated for this, what was the next step for you in trying to come up with a solution?
So this incubator, I mean, one of the things that we take great pride in is process. And, Josh started this process in Pfizer. It's been honed in the incubator. And now he actually co-launched a fellowship program at Stanford called Biodesign, all based on this process that's forever sort of under development because that's the nature of it, but is essentially an innovation process. And we all have our different ways of doing it. My personal way is I sort of first try to do a preparation phase. So in the preparation phase, I'd say I take 3 to 4 weeks and just read a ton and try to become absolutely knowledgeable about the past, present, and some ideas about the future of my specialty area, in this case, BPH. The goal is, after that period of time, to be able to speak with any specialist in the field and actually be able to stand toe-to-toe and talk about these things and really have, if you will, intellectual questions rather than, hey, what's BPH type questions. The second is I kind of look at surgery, if you will, as this sounds terrible, but like a sport, in that surgeons are athletes and they know when they're doing well, when they're not, when they're in a good state, how knowledgeable they are. It is a very physical thing to be doing. And so I like to get oriented physically. And the way I did it here was on eBay. I purchased the instruments from 2 urologists' practices. They were retiring. I went up on eBay and I bought it all and got it into our little office and hired the chief resident out of Stanford to spend some nights in the cadaver lab, just teaching me how to use all these things and try to learn how to finesse, cystoscopy, rigid cystoscopy, how to do a TURP, all these basics around this, just to see how, if you will, a surgeon thinks with her or his hands while doing these treatments or diagnostics. And then once I had all that together, now I'm ready to go to the real phase of this, which is talking. And it's finding urologists that are particularly, if you will, tuned to innovation. And in this case, it was Harchi Gill over at Stanford, and Tom McNicholas, who's in the UK, and Josh had known him through Pfizer back in the day, and be bouncing ideas off of these guys, talking about not ideas with regard to what's the next invention, how about this, but more about deeper understanding about why patients are treated the way they are, what the assumptions have been, what the teachings have been, and really try to think hard through if a change is warranted, and if so, where it might go from there.
So it sounds like you really just took a deep dive into the treatment landscape for men with an enlarged prostate at that time. And, now what were some of your conclusions when comparing all the various options after doing this?
Well, lots of things. So I guess my experience has been any good innovation or invention is based on insights. And it's this process, this early process in which we're really mining for insight, if you will. And often these insights have been entertained before, but never acted on. Sometimes no one's ever really known about them or thought about them. We had some of both in this project. One of them was, we do an interviewing of patients and doctors. And, one of the things that we found was a key area that was a true area of disparity between patient and doctor. And that actually had to do with ejaculatory function. So everyone knows LUTS due to BPH is quality of life. It affects your life. But also, I could say the insight was a really earth-shattering epiphany that sex is important to men. And it really had to do with ejaculatory function in that you really kind of were trained at that point in urology that if a man needs to be disobstructed and he needs to now move to surgery, the one thing he's going to have to be comfortable with is he's got to give up ejaculatory function, because if you do a really good TURP, you tend to knock out that, if you will, primary function of the prostate. And most men are in the age group where they're not having children, and et cetera, and it should be okay. Well, it turns out that if you really interview patients and say, yes, but that's fine. What if there were an option where nothing changed in that category? How would you feel about that? And to a man, regardless of their age or health status, they said, yes, that's what I would want. So that really struck us as, okay, we're finding something here because an option hasn't existed. No one's been questioning it that much, because you're trying to move a patient into the care that he needs. But if given the option, they would choose that. And another aspect of this that we kind of looked into was, if you will, how the therapies had performed to date. And so you had what we always do is we sort of chart efficacy against toxicity, if you will. So TURP, for instance, or actually not even that, simple prostatectomy would be the most effective, but also the most toxic with regard to adverse side effects. And then you work your way down diagonal, if you think of it that way, to TURP, maybe HOLEP, arguably right with TURP, PVP, and kind of work your way down to the far other corner where it's very low toxicity but low efficacy, and that's where medications reside. And then in between, there have been years and years of activity of what we call minimally invasive approaches, but they were all essentially one approach, and that is thermal ablation of cells. And so when we looked at that, it just never attained that quadrant that really patients were seeking, which was high efficacy and low toxicity. And the reason was, and this was probably the big insight, is that looking at all these options, toxicity and efficacy are linked. So you can get more efficacious, but you, by definition, need to be more toxic, if you will. And what we saw, for instance, in thermal therapies was this cycle, and the cycle continues today. It's continuing right now. And that is that whatever your thermal ablator was, and there was RF, interstitial laser, microwaves, hot water, everything but solar energy, I mean, but basically heat kills cells. So the more heat you put in, the more efficacious it would be and the more durable. So everyone ran their FDA studies at the highest dosage, got great efficacy and durability, and then put it out into the public. But what would happen is it would get into the clinic and the patients would then react and say, yeah, well, I don't think this is, and this was what we were finding, because we were doing this in 2004, and that was really kind of a heyday of tuna and microwave and that sort of thing. And what we were finding with the patients is they weren't viewing their experience as minimally invasive. They had a catheter for days, some for several weeks. They were, going through a difficult period before they started to feel better. And they sort of felt like that was an invasive experience. What turned out later, as we were doing our research, is other microwaves came out at very low power. And what happens is you get into the clinic, and if you dial back the amount of heat you put in, the patients do better. They sometimes don't need a catheter or a very short amount of time. They are happier. They're not bothering the practice as much. But what happens, because you low dose them 6 months, a year, 2 years later, they're coming back for treatment because it wasn't durable and didn't kind of do the thing. So there was no sort of tricking the system. You either have to go through the pain to get the gain, or it's going to keep coming back. So that's what we observed in all the literature. And if we had one major goal, it was to de-link toxicity from efficacy. Is there a way to open a prostate without having to, cause a lot of the side effects?
So that kind of leads into our next question then, and you kind of touched a little bit likely what these may be, but when looking to develop a new option, what were some of your kind of must-have criteria you really needed to have when developing a solution for these men?
Yeah. To me, this is a make it or break it thing, the needs specification, we call it. And oddly enough, a lot of development projects don't spend, in my opinion, enough time on that. And it's kind of, you create your goals, and ideally 2, 3, 10 years later, they are your same goals, and you are still measuring your efforts with regard to them if you've done this process right. And for us, it really was, the question we needed to answer is, what would be attractive enough to men who, quite frankly, always delay treatment? I always say the Y chromosome stands for why seek care, but basically are always delaying treatment and just kind of muscling up and saying, I can deal with this. What would actually get them off of their chair and say, you know what, I need treatment and this looks doable and it's going to help me? And this is what we came up with. And that was that it needed to be a rapid relief, because nothing was really offering that. So we're talking about within days, you're feeling normal. Okay, you're feeling like, okay, my life is not interrupted right now, and I'm starting to appreciate the improvements from this surgery or procedure I decided to have. Second was, I did touch upon this, and that is that don't give up sexual function. This is a quality of life disease. That's a very important quality of life issue. So ideally, no change to that as well. Third, one thing we found was a very high sensitivity to postoperative Foley catheters. Anyone who's had one agrees. And basically, they're highly irritative and you feel terrible and it's very unnatural. And so if there's a way to avoid that to the most possible, that's going to be a big for that as well, for recruitment or the shared decisions of men coming into the therapy. It had to be safer than surgery, but reproducibility was an important thing too. Really, it's going to have a technique or a device that just does it time and time again, and you can kind of count on it, if you will. And then it needed to be compatible with a low anesthetic environment. For many places, being offered in the office setting is very important, or maybe a very slick ASC that almost feels like an office, if you will, less threatening, and again, lowers the bar on decision-making for the man who wants to avoid a hospital and admissions and what have you. And then the criteria for everything, quite frankly, is it has to be durable. In BPH, durability bar is at 5 years. That's sort of been the tradition. In fact, we quote 7-10-year data for TURP, but there are not prospective data really pointing to that. These are all retrospective sort of population studies that get us there. But prospectively, good studies have been run to 5 years, and that's about where it goes. And then economic drivers, which is essential in today's healthcare. And it's almost like a puzzle that sounds like it would never work, but a patient can't pay too much out of pocket. Providers and facilities need to make enough for their time and effort. And all along, the payer or system needs to realize that they actually are having cost savings by offering this new paradigm.
Well, that's great. And so I think it would be very interesting for our listeners to take us through the thought process then that ultimately led to the creation of the UroLift System idea.
Well, okay, so we're leaving the needs specification process. So we've got our report card, if you will. And honestly, up to that point, we haven't thought about what we're going to do, because I found that the more you start thinking about ideas, you kind of fall in love with them and you start running with them. And that's a bad idea to do that before you really have honed what it is that you need to achieve. And a lot of devices get out there with great marketing and they're just beautiful looking devices, but they didn't solve the critical problem, if you will. So once we get to that, then we start inventing. And typically, with me anyway, I usually come up with 2 or 3 pretty bad ideas that work. Each one of them provides understanding that gets you to the idea that really is going to work. And in this case, our primary bad idea, if you will, was called, it was basically a capsulotomy. So the idea behind it was, okay, the prostate's congested and that's what's blocking flow. So if we could release that fibromuscular capsule, essentially the adenoma would popcorn out, if you will. And by doing that, that would release the congestion and micturition can happen normally after that. Turns out that really didn't work. But the reason it didn't work was the real aha moment for us. So, we've got cadavers and we've got what we rigged up was a balloon that would inflate inside the prostate and measure pressure as it was doing that. And then we would slowly sort of dissect the capsule, first the fascia, then the capsule, and try to look for, okay, when does it compliantly go, aha, now it's all great? The answer is never. You can get all the way through the capsule, still no change, through the adenoma, no change. And it isn't until you actually nick the urethra that pressure goes down, because what we realized was blowing up the balloon, it blew up maximally, this 40 French balloon, right out to the capsule. And what we haven't realized is that the prostate is actually compressible. And tissue shouldn't be compressible. It's basically water, which is non-compressible. But the prostate is as a structure because it's essentially a sponge. It's a lot of ducts. I mean, it's a secretion gland and it's formed that way. So you can, if you will, kind of compress the tissue and have it excrete and sort of like as you close the cells of a sponge. And that really got us thinking. So, I was in a cadaver lab and we were trying to do this capsulotomy thing. And it just dawned on us that, wow, you've got this fibromuscular capsule. You've got this highly compressible stuff that's in the way. Why not just move it out of the way? And so what we did I did in that cadaver lab was grabbed an Albaran bridge, deflected it into a lobe, pushed a wire through the bridge, around into the lobe, all the way up, dissected down, to the fascia, tied a pledget on there, and actually duct taped a size 0 suture, pulled that back through, and then tugged that down and pushed. Literally, we cut a little tip of a 10 ml syringe and pushed it up the size 0 suture to the urethral surface and compressed the lobe, and looked at it and did it on the other side, and it just perfectly opened the prostate. And it struck us that now this is what we're going to do. This makes a lot more sense, and it really leverages the anatomy and that insight that we'd sort of come up with on the compressibility.
Well, that's very interesting, to kind of come to that conclusion, which ultimately was a very good conclusion, brought about the UroLift system that we have now. And so, with the UroLift system, I understand after receiving appropriate clinical approval, once you've come up with the system, that the first 10 procedures were performed in Australia. Now, what was the delivery system like on that first generation device?
Probably a good word for it is Frankensteinian. But anyway, it was very manual, but on purpose. So the reason we didn't say, hey, let's take a couple years and develop a really slick device and then get into the clinic, was we needed to find out something critical. And that was, these implants, we really had enough of a feel that doing this technique was going to open the prostate lobe nicely. But what we didn't know is how did it feel? And we couldn't get that in any way except, quite frankly, through the clinic. And so the idea was, how do we get there as quickly and ethically as possible to answer this question? Because if it turns out they're highly irritative, well, done. We're not doing this project. That we'd just be inducing LUTs. So it really was an important aspect of this early clinical. So what we decided to do was make a completely manual system where you controlled everything, the needle length, the deflection, the suture tension, how you put things together was very manual that way. Henry Wu and Peter Chin were brave enough in Australia to take this on. It's fully IRB approved, and the Australian FDA called the TGA approved. It's the same process as the US. And basically, they came over in, I think it was October of 2005, and it was December where we were in Australia and they were treating the first 10 patients. So it was quite a run. The instrumentation was, if you picture, there's a first instrument in a sheath that you bear into the prostate lobe, and you basically manually extrude a nitinol needle. You could set it as long as 5 centimeters, and you would slowly put it through the prostate, and then you could push out a capsular tab and then retract the needle, and the tab would catch on the prostate. Now you'd have that, and what you would do is now disconnect from the sheath, pull that completely out over a meter-long Prolene suture, take a second device, ride that in over the suture like you would a balloon over a guide wire into the ureter, and you get into the prostate, connect, turn on water, and try to figure out where the heck you were for several minutes, and then find, okay, here's where the suture goes into the lobe. Now I'm going to move up to there, pull the suture, and compress the lobe. Now, we didn't just pull the suture, we actually tied it to a gauge so that the pulling was measured. And we could measure at what poundage, basically, it was set correctly. And it turned out it was always about a pound. So at about a pound, Henry or Peter would essentially manually affix what looked like a vascular clip, if you will, onto the suture and cut it. And one implant would be done. So the procedures took upwards of 2 hours each, and it was quite a laborious thing. But we were able to answer the critical question, 10 patients. And we said, hey, at 2 weeks, you should be feeling better. If you're not, you can now get a TURP. They were off a TURP waiting list. So that's the procedure they were waiting for, but they opted to try this one first. And 9 out of the 10 were very happy. One was in and out of retention because he had a ball valving middle lobe that we were scratching our heads saying, well, I'm not sure we want to do that. Because at the time, we hadn't really come up with a technique that's now pretty prevalent today on treating ball valving middle lobes, and it's very effective. But at that point, we were like, all right, we don't want to mess around with the trigone. We don't want to do this. And it turned out he ended up going in, having that resected, and doing fine after that. So that was our 10-patient experience.
Well, just fascinating. I mean, just really brilliant engineering and just kind of figuring that out. And now that you've kind of had that experience at that time, how did things kind of then change over multiple generations of devices and coming up with a system that could be used effectively?
Well, this manual system gave us the information. We set this up It truly was, the primary objective, treat the patient. The secondary objective is learn what worked. And from an instrument standpoint, I was talking about we had that gauge, for instance. We had a gauge on the suture. So we knew that if you could deploy somewhere between 0.8 and 1.2 pounds of pressure, so say a pound of tension on that suture each time, the system would work. So today, every UroLift device has a spring that applies a 1 pound tension to that suture before the final step is. Also the needle, it was adjustable out to 5 centimeters, which by the way is too long for every pelvis I've seen. But in any event, what we were able to do is we ran, for instance, spot fluoroscopy during each of these procedures. But we had the monitor turned away from the urologist because it wasn't for guidance for the procedure. It was to chronicle what was going on. And what we learned is that with a 20-degree deflection and a 3 centimeter needle, you could get outside of all of these prostates. So today, the current UroLift has a 3 centimeter needle, and the training is to put a 20-degree or more deflection. And so all these really important aspects of device design and how to do the procedure came out of these years in Australia, not just the first 10 patients, but the whole 64 that we ended up doing over a period of 3.5 years. And so the last part of that was, where do you put these things? And really at first it was, well, let's do a TURP, and we essentially pincushion the prostate and create this great big cavity. And what we realized is that that was not as important as creating a continuous channel. And so really it morphed from popping them all around the prostatic fossa to essentially mimicking an in situ Foley catheter without the catheter. So we want to have a channel from bladder neck coming back to Veru. And so that way there is sort of a, if you will, a defect in this blocked mechanism such that urine could get in there and bladder pressure could then open the prostate. And so that technique was developed in the latter part of all that clinical work. But that's really what set us up for the phase where we decided, okay, we can now bet. We can place the bet and say, we're going to spend millions of dollars on clinical studies, on a randomized trial and studies thereafter, because we know that this result is likely to be positive and we're going to move from there.
Now, were there any roadblocks along the way when bringing the system to market?
Nope, it was really easy. No, I always, when I talk to other entrepreneurs, I always say we basically had the full Monty here. Everything you can have, we had. So this was a full project in that it's not just a 510K and off you go. It was a full double-blinded randomized controlled trial where you've spent millions of dollars and you've hired a bunch of people and you don't know if you will be a company once the results come. So it's the full risk that way. But in addition to that, also it needed its own CPT codes, which is a non-trivial, typically 3-year process and involves needing a lot more data than the FDA requires, et cetera, et cetera. So it really was a full-blown project. But in addition to that, there were external things that happened that were difficult. So first, I remember having just several months of, it was 4 months of payroll left when the banking crisis hit. And so here I am trying to raise money for a new venture, and our stock is worth something a little more than GE at the time, just because of valuations plummeting, basically, because of the banking crisis. Luckily, we were able to finance the company with J&J Development Corp leading that round. We just skirted by death on that one. But also what happened almost simultaneously within that year was the FDA had their own issues where they had an internal whistleblower event that, it's a long story, but it effectively shut down what are called IDE clinical studies, which is new device clinical studies. And really, they literally at one point were saying you couldn't start a study unless you could prove that you would meet the endpoint, which of course is the entire reason you do a study. So it basically stopped studies for almost 2 years. And then, so that was trying to get money, also trying to progress. And what we ended up doing was initiating commercial launching in Europe to gain clinic knowledge, if you will, not necessarily to profit by doing that, because it wasn't that profitable, but it was more about, okay, how does this really get used in a clinic and what do we have to do to make it better? all while making our way through a very slow FDA process that only in 2011 or so were really able to start that.
So by 2011, Neo Tract was able to begin enrolling the first patients in the randomized trial or the LIFT study. Could you highlight some of the kind of main results of the study published in 2013?
Sure. Yeah, everyone at Neo Tract and Teleflex is very proud of this study in that, we just had a stellar crew under Nancy Isaac's leadership that ran just a remarkable study. I would contend that it is still the highest quality BPH device study done. And basically, what's a quality study? Well, one, you've got really good prospective endpoints, ways to measure them, ways to prove whether something works or not. But you're not only randomized, but you're blinding and you're testing your blinding and making sure it's good. And then, the last part is you're holding on to patients. And that's very difficult in BPH because it's a quality of life disease that, when you run a cancer study, patients are generally compelled to come back for follow-up to make sure they're okay and they are where they want to be. With BPH, it's difficult. You have guys that are, hey, I'm feeling better and I don't need to do this anymore. Or guys that are like, I'm not feeling better and I don't want the other options, so I'm out. And so you're really trying to keep them, and the clinical sites did a great job of keeping them in the study. We had a high level of response all the way out to 5 years. So what did we learn? We learned that our report card was working. So yes, it was safe, it is effective and durable. So those were really key, important things. But what we also measured were our goals, because there are safe and effective and durable options, and there were at that time. So our goal was never to just, hey, we can be another device in BPH. It was, can we get these achievements that may now attract men to get the care they really should be getting? And they were, remember, it was one, not needing a catheter. And this was everyone's first 5 procedures. But even though it was just their first 5 procedures, it was about 32% of them, they'd be void trialed. And if they passed void trial, they didn't get a catheter. And only about 32% failed void trial and required a catheter. And when they did, it was taken out typically the next day. So the average catheter time was a little under a day. So we felt, okay, this is a really good start. Maybe we can get better there, but we're way better than any other option at this point. And then the second was, how are they doing on recovery? So we measured return to normalcy, return to preoperative activity. All that happened within days. I think we might have been the first ones that measured IPSS change at an early time point at 2 weeks. No one wants to, typically if you're doing a TURP, you don't want to see your patient at 2 weeks. And we brought our patients in every trial back that early because it's a really good indicator of how they're doing, because they should be doing better by then. We measured sexual function in a way no one had up to that point. And it really was looking at what we called de novo sustained sexual dysfunction. And so that means it definitely started anew, because sexual dysfunction and BPH are independent predictors of each other. So they're prevalent. So you want to measure very well at baseline and then measure thereafter. And basically found and continue to find in every clinical study so far that there has been no incidence of de novo sort of new onset erectile or ejaculatory dysfunction. So really the first procedure to show that it preserves ejaculatory function reliably and remains that today. Really, there's only a couple of drugs that can claim that, alphafusis and certainly Cialis. So. But in any event, so really we're able to show that of these key aspects of the report card, we were hitting on them. And really after that, it was, okay, now how do we get into the coding and that sort of thing? And how do we convince and win the trust of payers that this is a viable option that should be done?
Well, thank you for sharing that. And the UroLift system has just really been a game changer for men with symptoms from an enlarged prostate. As a designated UroLift Center of Excellence in my practice, I've really witnessed firsthand the significant and sustained improvement in the urinary symptoms. Our symptom score improvement, or the IPS scores, have really mirrored that and then some of the LIFT study data. And men have really appreciated having an option that allows them, in many cases, to get off their prostate medication or avoid it altogether, with a solution that can be performed in the clinic setting, typically with no general anesthesia needed, and also typically without the need for a catheter, and then getting back to routine activities within a few days. Now, just really been certainly very fascinating so far. And I think it'd be just really interesting for our audience to get a closer look at how one of these devices, how it's kind of come along and gone through that progression, really kind of, get into it a little bit deeper. I know we're kind of reaching our time limit here on the podcast, but, Dr. Lamson has graciously agreed to stick around to film some bonus video content for the Prostate Health Academy, where we'll really give you a more in-depth look at the UroLift system and its evolution with time. For those that are interested, including other behind-the-scenes videos with our podcast guests, you can certainly sign up for the wait list. Make sure you have a chance to have access to it when we launch. All you have to do is go to www.prostatehealthacademy.com. Just scroll down and sign up for the wait list. So Dr. Lamson, any final thoughts for our listeners today?
Yeah, I do. So we're at an interesting time right now. I am extremely grateful and proud that because of the success that UroLift and Neo Tract, the company that formed around UroLift, have had, it has, if you will, really spurred on innovation and investment in the area of BPH. So essentially at this point, there are several efforts underway, companies moving forward into the space of BPH, because that's how venture capital works. Someone has success and everyone says, well, wow, we should do that too. But basically, what it means for urologists is that there are a lot of new options on their way. If they make it through clinical studies, if they make it through coding and everything, they're going to come to your clinic. And what I would say is, as we embark on this era, what I hope is that this talk and maybe some other readings that are out there, we can put that need criteria together and really think about that. Because unfortunately, a lot of things are going to come forward as they have, where it's, hey, I have another device, try this. And that's okay. But it's important to sort of realize, if the objective is to really keep shifting this paradigm, to keep bringing an option toward men that are sort of caught between therapies. To date, that really is UroLift. And I think I'd be disappointed if, down the road, there isn't something better. But ideally, we've created a category of care here. And it's one that we shouldn't compromise on. We shouldn't say, well, yeah, you need a catheter for a week, but whatever. Or, it mostly preserves sexual function. There's a lot of sort of like close but not quite. And we have to be careful of that, because once you get inconsistent outcomes, you lose that sort of trust of the patient body, saying, especially today with how people communicate, bad news travels very quickly and very broadly. And so really, I think we've done a good job of sort of saying, here's what it does, here's what it doesn't do. And so here are the expectations. And I hope the entire community of new devices coming can stay with that level of clarity, such that we can build this. It really is a shift going on. I mean, we looked the other day, 1 out of every 3 BPH procedures done today is a UroLift, which is kind of cool. But that won't stay that way. What I hope is that everything moves up, because there's so many men in between treatments that are either not compliant with their meds or just unhappy with their options, that really could enter into this, and what we end up with just a better overall treated paradigm. And I'm hoping that as this new era comes forward, we can be selective about where we spend our time and why.
Well, Dr. Lamson, it was certainly an honor to chat with you today on the Prostate Health Podcast. I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to visit with us today. You've really delivered significant value to our listeners. Thank you again.
Thanks. My pleasure.
Well, I really want to thank our loyal listeners for continuing to follow the Prostate Health Podcast. I wanted to give you all a heads up that we are nearing the end of our first season. Not to worry, though. We're not going to make you wait several months before the start of season 2, like you have to wait for your favorite TV show. In fact, we'll only be using August to prepare for season 2, which will be launching again the first week of September. Our last episode of season 1 will be released next Thursday, August 6th, and I've prepared something special. We'll be doing something unique that we've never done before, so make sure to stay tuned for next week's show. Thank you again for listening to the Prostate Health Podcast. We would love to have you join our podcast Facebook group at www.facebook.com/groups/prostate health podcast, or just use the Facebook group search function and search for the Prostate Health Podcast and ask to join. We'll see you at the next episode.